Snowflakes drifted under the streetlight, catching the glow like falling diamonds. My daughter stood outside the house, her thin coat no match for the biting Christmas wind. I saw her through the frosted glass, shivering, clutching the gift she had saved for months to buy. Inside, laughter roared. The fire crackled. And her husband, my son-in-law, was at the center of it all, raising his glass as if he were the king of Christmas. The door between them was more than just wood. It was power. He had locked her out on purpose, a punishment for daring to question him. Guests whispered, pretending not to notice. He smirked, certain he'd broken her spirit. I'll never forget the way his smug face gleamed in the light of that Christmas tree. And I'll never forget the voice inside me that whispered, "This ends tonight." Because what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had been watching, waiting, preparing. They thought she was alone. But they were wrong. My daughter, Emily, had always been the kind of woman who gave more than she ever received. Even as a child, she'd save half her candy to share with her younger cousins, or spend her allowance on gifts for others instead of herself. She had a softness in her heart that people often mistook for weakness. But I knew better. I knew that softness was strength, the kind that could bend without breaking. When she married Daniel, I wanted to believe she'd found someone who saw that strength too. He was charming at first, the kind of man who shook hands too firmly and made eye contact just long enough to convince you he was trustworthy. The neighbors adored him. At church gatherings, he'd crack jokes that had everyone doubled over. But beneath that polished smile, I saw something sharper, a hunger for control. It started small, the way it always does. Daniel would tease Emily about the way she dressed, telling her certain colors made her look cheap. He'd correct her stories in front of friends, as if her memory couldn't be trusted. When she laughed too loudly, he'd rest his hand on her knee, squeezing just hard enough to remind her who held the power. I tried to intervene once. I remember pulling Emily aside in the kitchen during a family barbecue. "Sweetheart," I whispered, handing her a plate of burgers. "Does he treat you right?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "He just wants the best for me, Mom." Don't worry. But I did worry. I noticed how she started apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. I noticed how her wardrobe shrank to neutral tones. I noticed how she rarely visited without him. The real shift came when Daniel discovered how generous Emily was with money. She'd always saved carefully, keeping a little piggy bank tucked in her nightstand. It wasn't much, just coins and small bills she slipped away over the years. But it was hers. One day, that piggy bank vanished. Emily asked about it, and Daniel laughed, saying he'd reinvested it into something useful. She never saw it again. That piggy bank became symbolic to me. It wasn't just about money. It was about the way Daniel chipped away at her independence, piece by piece. By the time Christmas rolled around, the pattern was clear. Daniel played the part of the doting husband in public, but behind closed doors, he was cruel. He mocked Emily's cooking, saying his mother's recipes were better. He forgot her birthday, yet made a spectacle of his own. Worst of all, he turned gatherings into stages where Emily was the punchline. I'll never forget one evening in particular. We were at a neighborhood holiday dinner, the house filled with twinkling lights and carols humming through the speakers. Emily had baked 3 pies, spending hours perfecting the crusts. Daniel took one bite, made a face, and set his fork down with a dramatic sigh. "Bless her heart," he said loudly enough for the table to hear. "She tries, doesn't she?" The room erupted in nervous laughter. Emily's cheeks flushed crimson, but she stayed silent, staring down at her plate. That was the first sting, the moment I knew this wasn't just harmless teasing. It was humiliation, calculated and cruel. I wanted to leap across the table to wipe that smirk off his face. But Emily caught my eye, shook her head ever so slightly, and forced a smile. It was her way of saying, "Please not here, not now." I kept quiet that night, but inside, a seed of resolve was planted. Because humiliation has a way of growing. And what I saw on Christmas night, with my daughter freezing outside while her husband toasted inside, was only the harvest of what he'd been sowing all along. And I wasn't about to let it continue. That humiliation would be the last gift he ever gave her. After that neighborhood dinner, things didn't get better. They got worse. Daniel thrived on control, and once he realized Emily wouldn't fight back, he tightened his grip. He criticized her in subtle ways that outsiders wouldn't notice. But I did. A misplaced word became an excuse for him to sigh and roll his eyes. A forgotten ingredient in a meal was proof she couldn't manage even the simplest tasks. Slowly, Emily's confidence eroded. She stopped volunteering for community events, though she had once been the first to sign up. She withdrew from friends, often making excuses about being too tired or busy with the house. But I knew the truth. She was exhausted from living in Daniel's shadow. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying the things I'd seen. Emily's shoulders slumped lower each visit. Her smile grew thinner, brittle, as if it might snap at any moment. There were dark circles under her eyes, the kind you can't hide with makeup. And every time she left my house, Daniel's voice would echo from the car, sharp and commanding, before the door even closed. It wasn't just the small cruelties anymore. Daniel escalated to controlling the finances. He intercepted mail, decided how much Emily could spend, and belittled her for buying even the smallest treat for herself. "Why waste money on books?" he sneered once, when she tried to order a novel she'd been waiting months to read. "You should be focusing on this family, not living in fantasy worlds." The neighbors, once charmed by Daniel, began to whisper behind closed doors. Some believed the act he put on, convinced he was a good man who simply had a difficult wife. Others noticed the cracks, but stayed silent, not wanting to meddle. That silence isolated Emily further. She called me late one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, am I difficult?" she asked. My chest tightened. "Of course not, sweetheart. Why would you say that?" "It's just... He keeps telling me I'm ungrateful, that I embarrass him. Maybe I should try harder," I wanted to scream, to tell her to leave right then. But I also knew pushing too hard could backfire. Instead, I said softly, "Emily, you are not the problem. Don't you ever believe otherwise?" Still, I worried she didn't believe me. The emotional toll began to leave physical marks. Emily lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. She grew pale, her energy drained, and though she tried to hide it, I knew she cried herself to sleep most nights. But Daniel wasn't finished. He used the holidays, the very season of family and giving, as a stage for his cruelty. At a Christmas Eve gathering, he handed out gifts to everyone in the room, each one neatly wrapped with ribbons. When it came to Emily, he passed her a tiny box. She opened it to find a pair of cheap dish gloves. "Something useful," he announced with a grin as the room awkwardly chuckled. Emily smiled faintly, but I saw the tears pooling in her eyes. That was the night I thought I'd lost her. She looked so small, so defeated, like a candle flickering in the wind. But then, something unexpected happened. After everyone left, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Lawson, a retired schoolteacher, pulled me aside. She had lived next door to Emily for years and had noticed more than I realized. "I see what he's doing," she whispered firmly. "Don't you let him convince her she's alone. She's not while I'm here." It was a small gesture, but it cracked the wall Daniel had built around my daughter. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Because Emily wasn't entirely isolated. People were watching, people cared. And one day soon, Daniel would learn what it meant to be outnumbered. That was the first time someone reminded me I wasn't alone. Daniel never liked losing control. So when Emily began spending more time with me and Mrs. Lawson, He noticed, and he didn't like it. He tightened his grip in ways that made my blood boil. He began monitoring Emily's phone, demanding to know who she was texting. He'd show up unannounced at my house, leaning casually in the doorway as though his presence was normal. But the way his eyes scanned the room told me otherwise. He wasn't visiting. He was inspecting. One afternoon, Emily arrived at my home, her hands trembling, clutching an opened envelope. It was a notice from their landlord. Daniel hadn't been paying rent, even though he'd told her he had. Instead, he'd been funneling money into a secret account only he controlled. "Mom, what am I supposed to do?" she whispered, panic lacing her voice. Before I could answer, Daniel's voice boomed from the porch. "Emily! Get out here now!" I felt rage coil in my chest. But Emily surprised me. She folded the letter, tucked it into her purse, and calmly said, "I'll be right there." When she stepped outside, Daniel's words carried through the thin door. "You don't keep secrets from me. Ever." And then, silence. Not because he stopped talking, but because Emily didn't respond. That silence rattled him. I could tell by the way he stormed back to the car, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. It was the first crack in his armor, but Daniel wasn't finished. He turned to more dangerous weapons, authority and reputation. Weeks later, Emily called me in tears. Daniel had threatened to report her as unstable to family and friends, claiming she had episodes. He even hinted he might speak to the police, spinning a story that she was paranoid and emotional. It was the kind of lie that could ruin her reputation forever. That night, as she sat at my kitchen table with her head in her hands, Mrs. Lawson placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "bullies always overplay their hand. Always. But you need to protect yourself. Start writing everything down, dates, times, words. Keep the proof." That advice became a lifeline. Emily started a notebook, carefully documenting every insult, every financial slip, every controlling act. She kept receipts, copies of emails, even recorded snippets of conversations when she could. One evening, as she flipped through the pages, I saw something change in her. Her hands no longer shook as she held the notebook. Her voice steadied when she said, "He can say what he wants. But I have the truth right here." I smiled, pride swelling in my chest. That notebook was more than paper and ink. It was her shield. But Daniel, blinded by arrogance, believed he still had control. At a family gathering, he tried to embarrass her again, mocking her for forgetting to send out holiday cards. Emily didn't flinch this time. She calmly pulled out a stack of addressed envelopes from her bag and set them on the table. "Actually," she said, her tone even, "I did. You must have misplaced them." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. For the first time, Daniel looked unsettled, his smirk faltering, as relatives exchanged glances. That night, as I walked Emily to her car, she whispered, "Mom, I'm not as powerless as he thinks." And she was right. Because Daniel had no idea what was coming. They thought they still had control. They didn't. When Daniel realized Emily was no longer crumbling under his words, he changed tactics. He turned outward, twisting the narrative before anyone could see through him. Rumors began to ripple through the neighborhood. Whispers at church, murmurs at the grocery store. Emily was ungrateful. She was difficult. Some even said she was mentally unstable. I knew exactly where those words had come from. Daniel's silver tongue. He recruited what I call flying monkeys, people eager to carry his version of events. His mother called Emily late one night, voice dripping with accusation. "Daniel tells me you've been cold to him, that you don't appreciate what he does for you. Do you know how lucky you are?" Lucky. The word nearly broke Emily. But instead of lashing out, she quietly wrote the date and time in her notebook, adding the quote beneath it. Another line of evidence. The pressure mounted. Daniel spread lies that Emily was careless with money, even though he controlled every penny. He hinted to friends that she had moods that made her unreliable. And when Emily tried to speak up, people looked at her with pitying eyes, as though she'd already proven him right. It wore on her. Nights were long, sleep restless. She confessed to me once, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing, Mom. Like he's erasing me." I held her close, my own anger a silent fire. He can't erase the truth, not if you hold on to it. That notebook became her lifeline, and over time it grew thick, pages filled with Daniel's contradictions, receipts for things he claimed he hadn't bought, text messages laced with cruelty, dates of missed payments, even screenshots of his online accounts. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a case. And she wasn't alone. Mrs. Lawson began discreetly checking in on her, offering advice and encouragement. Even one of Daniel's co-workers, who'd seen glimpses of his temper at the office, quietly told Emily, "If you ever need someone to back you up, I'll speak." The walls were closing in, but not around Emily, around Daniel. Still, he didn't see it. Blinded by arrogance, he doubled down. At a neighborhood meeting, he stood up and announced that Emily had been struggling emotionally and that he'd been patient with her. His tone was polished, his smile rehearsed. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some nodding, others frowning. And then, in a moment that felt almost cinematic, Emily rose to her feet, calm, steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I appreciate your concern," she said evenly, "but I'll let the truth speak for itself when the time comes." Daniel's face tightened, his eyes narrowing for just a second before he forced a laugh. But I saw it. Everyone saw it. The first true crack in his composure. Because Emily wasn't the timid woman he thought he'd broken. She was preparing. Each day, each lie, each humiliation he delivered only added weight to the rope he was weaving around himself. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be Emily who hung by it. It would be him. The symbolic piggy bank came back into play too. One night, Emily confessed to me that she had started saving again. Not in coins this time, but in copies of everything she collected. She kept them tucked away in a small metal box, a replacement for the one Daniel had stolen years ago. "This time," she said, eyes glinting with quiet determination, "he won't take it from me." Her strength was no longer flickering. It was burning. And Daniel, he didn't even know the fire was at his doorstep. The day of reckoning was coming, and no one could stop it. The reckoning came sooner than Daniel expected. It was New Year's Eve, the night he had planned another grand gathering. His family, his friends, the neighbors, everyone he used as an audience, were packed into the living room, champagne glasses in hand, waiting for midnight. He stood at the center, basking in the glow of admiration, telling stories that made him the hero. But Emily was different that night. She wasn't the silent, shrinking shadow he was used to. She walked into the room wearing a deep green dress, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. For the first time in months, maybe years, she looked like herself again. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the air, the hush before a storm, the heavy silence before a verdict. Daniel raised his glass. "To another year of strength and family," he declared. Cheers erupted, laughter ringing out. Then Emily's voice cut through, calm but sharp. "Before we toast," she said, "I have something to share." The room quieted. All eyes turned to her. Daniel chuckled nervously, trying to play it off. "Emily, darling, maybe later." But she didn't stop. She set a small metal box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were neatly stacked papers, receipts, printed emails, and her leather notebook. She pulled it out, placed it flat on the table, and began to read. The room shifted as her words filled the air. Dates. Times. Quotes. Every cruel remark. Every lie. Every dollar Daniel had reinvested into his secret accounts. Her voice was steady, almost detached, but the evidence was undeniable. Gasps echoed as she revealed the landlord's eviction notice, the receipts for gifts Daniel claimed he'd bought, but actually charged to Emily's hidden savings. Then she played a recording, Daniel's voice, sharp and venomous, calling her worthless, and warning her never to tell anyone. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's face drained of color. His glass shook in his hand. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "She's twisting things, she's paranoid." But the weight of truth had already crushed the mask he wore. Guests exchanged looks. Whispers broke out. His own relatives pulled back, shame and disbelief written across their faces. Emily closed the notebook with a soft thud. She looked at him directly. No tears, no trembling. Only resolve. "I don't want apologies, Daniel," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the stunned room. "I want change. And if you won't change, then I will." The power shifted in that moment. Everyone could feel it. Daniel's hand trembled as he tried to protest, but his words collapsed into silence. He had built his empire on control, but control is fragile when the truth is exposed. And now, with the spotlight glaring down, he was left with nothing but his own lies unraveling around him. I'll never forget the sight of him that night. His shoulders slumped, his smirk gone, his eyes darting desperately for allies who no longer existed. And I'll never forget the way Emily stood there, steady as stone, reclaiming every ounce of dignity he had tried to steal. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks boomed in the distance. But in that room, the only sound was the shattering of Daniel's reign. And Emily was finally free. After that night, nothing was the same. Daniel tried, of course. Men like him always do. The morning after New Year's Eve, he called Emily, begging her to fix the misunderstanding. He swore he'd change, swore he'd been under stress, swore it was all blown out of proportion. His words, once sharp as knives, were suddenly soft and desperate. But Emily didn't waver. For the first time in her marriage, she didn't fold. She told him, with a voice calm and steady, "This isn't about stress, Daniel. This is about who you are, and I won't let you define me anymore." She filed for separation that week. The fallout was swift. Neighbors who once clapped along with Daniel's jokes now crossed the street to avoid him. His family, embarrassed by the truth, offered little support. The community he had weaponized against Emily now saw him for what he truly was, a bully hiding behind charm. Emily moved into a small rental house not far from mine. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she had space that belonged to her alone. She filled it with light, plants by the windows, books stacked on shelves, a cozy quilt on the sofa. Slowly, her smile returned, not forced this time, but genuine. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes, she showed me something that made my throat tighten. On a shelf in her new living room sat the small metal box, the one she'd filled with evidence. But now it was different. Instead of receipts and records, it was filled with folded bills and coins. "My new piggy bank," she said with a grin. "But this time it's not for him to take. It's for me, for my future." That box became her symbol. Once it represented loss and control. Now it represented freedom and growth. She didn't just rebuild her home, she rebuilt her life. Emily started volunteering again, this time at a women's shelter. She shared pieces of her story, helping others recognize the signs of control before it was too late. And in doing so, she found something Daniel could never give her: purpose. The transformation was stunning. The same woman who once shrank under humiliation now stood tall, her voice steady and clear. When people asked about Daniel, she didn't flinch. She simply said, He taught me what I will never accept again. As for Daniel, his downfall was quiet but brutal. His reputation never recovered. The friends who once praised him kept their distance. At work, whispers followed him, and promotion slipped through his fingers. He had built his life on perception, and once that crumbled, there was nothing left. I remember visiting Emily a few months later. She was sitting on her porch, sunlight warming her face, a cup of tea in her hand. She looked at peace in a way I hadn't seen in years. "You know, Mom," she said softly, "sometimes I think back to that Christmas night, standing outside in the cold. And I realize I was freezing then because I didn't know my worth. But now I'll never stand in the cold again." I smiled, my chest swelling with pride. "You've come a long way, sweetheart." She nodded, her eyes shining. "And this is just the beginning." That contrast struck me deeply. The story had started with her locked outside, shivering while Daniel celebrated. And now she was inside, warm, surrounded by peace of her own making. She hadn't just survived, she had reclaimed her life. And watching her, I realized something important. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. But when it rises, it's unstoppable. Emily's story wasn't one of defeat. It was one of triumph. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Have you ever faced favoritism, betrayal, or the sting of someone trying to strip away your worth? Have you ever stood outside in the cold, wondering if anyone would see the truth? Emily's story is proof that no matter how dark the night feels, the dawn always comes. Bullies, manipulators, and abusers thrive on silence, but the moment you claim your voice, their power begins to crumble. I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Tell us how you rose above, how you found strength when others thought you were broken. Because every story of survival lights the path for someone still trapped in the shadows. And remember this: worth isn't something they give you. It's something you claim for yourself.